Chapter 5. Chaotic bodies. In fact, the path of evolution, so frequently compared to some steadily rising mountain slope, is far more like a footway worn by leisurely wanderers in an undulating country. Excelsior biology is a popular and poetic creation. The real form of a phylum, or line of descent, is far more like the course of a busy man moving about a great city. Sometimes it goes underground, sometimes it doubles and twists in tortuous streets, now it rises far overhead along some viaduct. Upward and downward these threads of pedigree interweave, slowly working out a pattern of accomplished things that is difficult to interpret, but in which scientific observers certainly fail to discover that inevitable tendency to higher and better things with which the word evolution is popularly associated. Wells, Zoological Retrogression. Early writings in science and science fiction, p. 159. Anthropic narratives are in their own way highly directive. They accomplish a straightforward reversal of narratives of progress. That is, while anthropic plotting is productive, capable of generating an intriguing variety of abhuman possibilities, one Gothic entropy can be seen as a traditional narrative structure. It moves steadily, without detour or interruption, towards a telos, albeit the negative telos of loss of specificity. What Wells describes by contrast in the quote above is a narrative model more consistent with Darwin's own, a model of random movement, non-directive, non-telic, aimless and errant. Eric White identifies such a narrative movement as picaresque, as opposed to the comic romance of progressivist history. The temporal unfolding of reality is open-ended and unpredictable, a suite of contingent circumstances rather than an inexorable march towards some predestined goal. The random processes of evolution, like the picaresque, comprise a degree zero form of implotment whose principle of articulation is not teleological but successive, and. The end of meta-narratives in evolutionary biology, p. 63. Anthropic plotting, which bears rough similarities to tragic plotting, evacuates the world of meaningfulness. Complex structures, bodies, cultures, lose their complexity. The achievements, or at least the consolidations, of the forward-moving evolutionary process are undone. The anthropic imagination is held in thrall to an unbroken prospect of barrenness, emptiness, silence, indifferentiation, much like the prospect that greets the time traveler at the end of his journeyings. In picaresque evolutionist plotting, by contrast, meaningfulness has never even been an option. All the structures it generates are contingent and provisional. They were produced by accident, others would have done as well, nor will they persist unaltered, and thus are without intrinsic meaning. Or rather, they mean nothing more than what they are. Such a narrative does not lead to barrenness, however, like entropy. It leads nowhere at all, but on the way to nowhere it reveals itself as highly ingenious and productive. Margot Norris argues that for Darwin, the prospect of the randomness of natural processes was by no means a distressing one. He was able to recognize that madness was not the only alternative to reason and that chaos does not logically follow the abolition of conscious design beasts of the modern imagination. p. 2.2. For Darwin, that is, the intricacy and superb functionality of biological forms contrasted markedly with the chaotic randomness of the processes that, accidentally, generate form. The fin de siècle Gothic, however, envisions something rather more terrible. In its plots of both parallel evolutions and abhuman becomings, a randomly working nature is figured as too imaginative, too prolific. Any admixture of diverse morphic traits is possible, so that even highly complex bodies, ingeniously specialized for their environment, the new crew of the Lansing, for example, are abominable. 5.1 The body as palimpsest. Mine own did struggle terribly with a yellow thing which I perceived to be a man with 4 arms. And surely it was a mighty and brutish thing, and so broad and bald as an ox, and the lower arms were huge and greatly haired, and the fingers of the hands did have the nails grown into horrid talons, as that they should grip very bitter. And the breath of the man-beast came at me, and did sicken me, and I held the face off from me, for I had died with horror, if that it had come more nigh, and surely the mouth of the man was small and shaped so that I knew it did never eat about that it did slay, but to drink as a vampire. And it did make other sounds, and an horrid screeching, so that truly, but the way of it I conceived that it cried out unknown and half-shapen words at me. Hodgson, The Nightland, pages 497-9. It is impossible to maintain the idea of an integral human identity within such a scenario, Gothic or otherwise. In the first place, the picaresque narrative of evolution does not mark out humanity as its telos, it has none, nor can humanity foresee its own direction within such a narrative. The species was an accident like any other, and the only guarantees made by Darwin were that the vast majority of species would become extinct, and that those who remained would not survive unchanged. Point 3. More startling, perhaps, was the notion that man never had been properly a man, to use the Hodgson phrase quoted in Chapter 3. In The Origin of Species, talking of species in general, Darwin presents the body as a compendium, on and within which the whole history of the species is inscribed. Each very highly developed organism has passed through many changes, and each modified structure tends to be inherited, so that each modification will not readily be quite lost, but may be again and again further altered. Hence the structure of each part of each species is the sum of many inherited changes, through which the species has passed during its successive adaptations to changed habits and conditions of life. p. 143. He would bring this point closer to home in The Descent of Man. We have seen in the last 2 chapters that man bears in his bodily structure clear traces of his descent from some lower form. p. 445. Norris describes this newly conceived body as a palimpsest, a document on which many records have been made or stories told, one imperfectly erased to make room for the next, none having any meaningful relation to the others. Her argument is worth quoting at length. The body, Darwin discovered, was as much a palimpsest as the earth, an irregular, haphazard, and incomplete inscription, an erasure, of its own evolutionary history, of changing conditions and their impact on its form, of habits acquired and abandoned, of necessities emergent and vanished, of instincts developed and repressed, and of shifting affinities and departures. In order to read the body in this way, certain metaphysical preconceptions about its unity and integrity had to be scuttled. Darwin, like Freud in his approach to dreams, studied the human body in detail rather than en masse, not in its unity and internal coherence, but in its fragments, organs, structures, functions, and their correlation to those of other creatures. He found that, quite unlike an efficient machine, the human body exhibits many anachronisms. Read in this way, as a palimpsest, the human being is no longer the prototype of ideal form in its unity, its originality, its integrity, and its perfection. Hybrid and even teratoid. As it were, in both body and mind, it contains little bits and traces of other animals. Pages 39-40. Such a body is not just liable to abhuman becomings, but also reveals itself as always already abhuman, a strange compilation of morphic traits, fractured across multiple species boundaries. Wells, Ever ever obliging about impressing upon his readers the most unsettling of Darwin's arguments, would describe the human body as a modified fish body. The skull is of piscine cranium, ossified and altered, the nose is a fish's nasal organ, the eardrum is derived from a gill slit twisted up to supplement the aquatic internal ear. Nor have the modifications been made with particular skill or care. Everywhere we look we should find the anatomy of a fish twisted and patched to fit a life out of water, nowhere organs built specially for this very special condition. Zoological Retrogression, pages 164-5. Criminal Anthropology. At the sight of that skull, I seemed to see all of a sudden, lighted up as a vast plain. Under a flaming sky, the problem of the nature of the criminal, an atavistic being who reproduces in his person the ferocious instincts of primitive humanity, and the inferior animals. Thus were explained anatomically the enormous jaws, high cheekbones, prominent superciliary arches, solitary lines in the palms, extreme size of the orbits, handle-shaped or sessile found in criminals, savages, and apes, insensibility to pain, extremely acute sight, tattooing, excessive idleness, love of orgies, and the irresistible craving for evil for its own sake, the desire not only to extinguish life in the victim, but to mutilate the corpse, tear its flesh, and drink its blood. 6. Any layer of text within the palimpsestic body may be seen as an available narrative possibility, which the body may seize upon and develop. This would constitute a reversion to some earlier form, whose history still remains, as a trace memory of sorts, in the body of the descendant. Such a possibility was of course highly compatible with anthropic narratives, but this narrative of reversion was an unpredictable one. So many conflicting and mutually irrelevant histories were stored in the body that the most surprising morphic trait could be accessed and realized. Here we have a body both anthropic and chaotic. The fin de siècle science of criminal anthropology, most commonly associated with the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso, was focused on such an abhuman body as I have described here. Lombroso is most famous for his theory of the born criminal, whose innate propensity for criminal behaviors could be explained by his atavism, or reversion to now latent characteristics that had been dominant in some earlier moment of the species' history. The atavist was, in short, an evolutionary throwback, but one who could be thrown back along a number of possible trajectories. The body, for Lombroso, was a transparency of the intellect, emotions, and moral nature of the subject it contained. Innate criminality bespoke itself in certain physical stigmata, physiognomical characteristics shared with lower species or lower races, but no longer found in the normal Caucasian. 9. The most common of the visible stigmata included an irregular or disproportionate cranium, facial asymmetry, prognathism, a jutting jaw, large or misplaced hairs, receding forward, and ape-like disproportion of the limbs. The dissector's knife also revealed lesions and abnormalities of the brain and other structural irregularities. The marks of reversion, in other words, could be found across the entire body within the skull, face, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, cheeks, palate, teeth, jaw, hair, thorax, pelvis, abdomen, limbs, and brain, which showed abnormal affinities with those of species or races further down the evolutionary scale. Atavistic anomalies were not in themselves causative, but denoted a savage and animalistic nature that prompted criminal acts. Rodent, lemur, chicken, man. The range of animal species from which atavistic traits could be drawn was truly remarkable. Lombroso does not restrict himself to the most recent human ancestors, the primates. His criminal also shows abnormal physical correspondences with remote ancestors 10 like dogs, rodents, lemurs, reptiles, oxen, birds of prey, and domestic fowl, to name a few, pages 13-22. For instance, the criminal may exhibit the flattened nose and sugar loaf skull of the ape, P7, handle-shaped ears like the chimpanzees, P14, a lemurine apophysis, at the angle of the jaw, P15, and rodent-like cheek pouches, P16. His supernumerary teeth recall the double row of teeth found in snakes, his hooked nose, the beak of the bird of prey, P7. Another study documents additional ribs and vertebrae in 10 criminals out of 100, and also too few, in the same proportion, which reminds us of the great variableness of these bones in the lower vertebrates. Illustrative studies in criminal anthropology. P189. The multiplication of examples like these produces a certain dizzying incoherence, not least of all because domestic fowl, for one, do not share with humans a common line of descent. Nor does Lombroso explain how the process of atavism could be so indiscriminate, causing one criminal to recapitulate the ape, another the reptile, another the rodent, nor why one criminal with multiple stigmata would simultaneously recapitulate all of these lower species. Some of his criminal animal correspondences are governed by metaphor, the criminal's double row of teeth recalling the legendary deceitfulness of the snake, his hooked nose, the fierceness of the bird of prey, Lombroso Ferrero, P7. But other correspondences run counter to logic, that the physical characteristics the criminal shares with omnivores should signal his desire to mutilate the corpse of the victim, tear its flesh, and drink its blood, that those he shares with lemurs, apes, and reptiles should signal his innate tendency to vanity, wantonness, vengefulness, and impulsive rage. Lombroso here seems to be playing on the commonplace that certain human behaviors, thieving, viciousness, love of drunken orgies are beastly, rather than developing strict animal-human correspondences. However, rather than faulting the science of Lombroso, still recalled as an exemplary empiricist 11, I will note instead the gothic quality of his atavistic body. This is something rather worse than Wells' fish human twisted and patched to fit a life out of water, perhaps worse than Hodgson's braying octopus seal man. Atavism reveals that the human body is too compendious, too full of incompatible histories, too full of strange narrative lines waiting to be developed. The human body, at least potentially, is utterly chaotic, unable to maintain its distinctions from a whole world of animal possibilities. Other abhumans. Despite its intensive theorizing of abhumanness, criminal anthropology was quite deliberately engaged in reconstituting what Darwinism had undone, the stability and integrity of the human species. Abhuman becomings were always possible, according to the Darwinist or pseudo-Darwinist models on which Lombroso based his work, but not for oneself. Atavists were defectives, misfits, criminals, riffraff anomalies against which the fully human subject stood out in relief. One will not be surprised to discover that Lombroso's standard of this fully human subject was the non-criminal, white European adult male. Besides the wide range of animal species, then, the nature and extent of the white man's atavism could be measured against other subjects who were not quite subjects, not quite fully evolved, not quite human, non-whites, women, and children. The psychology of the savage races, purported to be an altogether thieving, indolent, childish, dishonest, vicious, licentious, and cannibalistic lot, furnished the reader with a perhaps more compelling point of reference for atavism than did lemurine jaw angles. Criminal behaviors denoted a return to the early brutal egotism natural to the primitive races, which manifests itself in homicide, theft, and other crimes. Lombroso Ferrero pages 72-3. As with savages, criminals' passions are swift but violent, vengeance is considered as a duty, and they have a strong love for gambling, alcohol, and complete idleness. Like New Caledonians, criminals would rather die than work. Like North American Indians, they enjoy savage games. Lombroso, Criminal Anthropology, pages 37-8. They are shameless, like the South American Indians, who do not know how to blush. They are inherently dishonest. Like those inveterate thieves, the natives of British New Guinea. Havelock Ellis, The Criminal, pages 138, 181. The criminal also recapitulates savage behavior in his cultural practices. This explains, for instance, the primitive drawings and inscriptions found in prison cells, the slang, hieroglyphic codes, and elaborate sign language of the European criminal, and his obsession with elaborate tattoos. Lombroso considered this last a particularly potent proof of the atavism of the criminal. According to one of his prison subjects, when our tattooing is very odd and grotesque, and spreads over the whole body, it is for us thieves what the black dress coat and the decorated vest is to society. The more we are tattooed, the greater is our esteem for one another. The more an individual is tattooed, the more authority he has over his companions. Very often, another told me, when we visited prostitutes, and they saw us covered all over with tattoos, they overwhelmed us with presents, and gave us money instead of demanding it. If all that is not atavism, Lombroso concludes triumphantly, atavism does not exist in science. Illustrative Studies in Criminal Anthropology, p. 195. Within such an argument, the partial humanness, or abhumanness, of the African, American Indian, Polynesian, and other savage peoples is simply a given. They represented a point somewhere between the ape and the white man on the evolutionary scale. Point 12 according to physical anthropologists like George Samuel Morton and Paul Broca, these races evince marked physical inferiority to the Caucasian, their lesser skull size, and thus intelligence, more prognathous angle of profile, inferior development of the frontal lobes of the brain, etc. proved that they simply had not evolved far enough to be characterized as completely human/s, and according to social evolutionists like Herbert Spencer and Benjamin Kidd, the social institutions of non-whites were similarly undeveloped. Spencer defines social evolution as increasing complexity, the natural progress towards greater size, coherence, multiformity, and definiteness that also characterized physical evolution. Spencer, Principles of Sociology, p. 597. All existing and extinct races could be ranked according to their status within the chain of evolution, from the simple nomadic tribal structure to the semi-settled nation-state to modern industrial civilization, pages 549-55. Less evolved races were culturally and behaviorally primitive as well. Spencer's Fuegians, for example, a migratory race governed within only a very loose tribal structure, are characterized by promiscuity, cannibalism, greed, thievery, duplicity, and lack of intellectual curiosity. Descriptive Sociology, table I. All of those characteristics Lombroso deplores in his atavistic criminal type. The Fuegian spoken language scarcely deserves to be called articulate. They are less human, in short, than the modern European. Kidd, on the other hand, states with some magnanimity that evolutionary superiority is not determined by color, or descent, or even high intellectual capacity. It belongs to the race possessing in the highest degree the qualities contributing to social efficiency, such as strength and energy of character, humanity, probity, and integrity, and simple-minded devolution to conceptions of duty. Social Evolution, pages 348g.I4. However, these qualities are possessed only by whites, as dictated by the cosmic order of evolution. The colored races have stagnated in those temperate regions where the conditions of life are easiest, while the northern races, under the press of a harsher climate, evolved into the possession of energy, enterprise, and social efficiency, p. 340. Thus, the long, slow process of evolution has produced a profound dividing line between the inhabitants of the tropics and those of the temperate regions. Kidd, p. Control of the Tropics, p. 30. Ernst Haeckel's biogenetic law of recapitulation provided a further justification for the construction of racial hierarchies during Lombroso's time. Haeckel's theory that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that the human individual passes through its whole history of species evolution during gestation, was extended to both human psychology and socio-cultural evolutionism. Point 1 according to psychological recapitulationism. The intellect and moral sense of the child is also in embryonic form, en route to adulthood the child must pass through the process of socio-cultural evolution undergone by its remote human ancestors. The child is, in other words, a little savage, but more to the point, the savage may be profitably compared to the white child. This argument fits comfortably into the imperialist policies of 19th century Europe, resulting, at best, in a model of paternalism. Europe would look after its colonies because their native populations, like little children, were not fit to look after themselves. In particular, they were not fit to manage the tremendous natural resources with which they had been blessed. These resources would have to be administered by the more highly evolved Caucasian races, ever mindful of questions of responsibility to weaker races, who take us back to the very childhood of the world, and with whom the first principle of successful policy is that we are dealing, as it were, with children. Kidd, The Control of the Tropics, pages 33-4. The recapitulationist argument is strongly evident in Lombroso's treatment of non-whites, who are repeatedly compared, in their egoism, their impatience, their petty dishonesties, their love of bright objects and fancy dress, to children. Lombroso saw the child as a primitive human and a natural criminal. The moral sense is certainly wanting in children in the first months or even the first years of life. Young children are impatient, deceitful, obstinate, vain, vengeful, cruel, violent-tempered, obscene, even prone to alcoholism. Criminal Anthropology applied to pedagogy, pages 54-6. In other words, a certain degree of criminality in children is normal, but as the normal child grows up in the proper environment, all this criminality disappears. Just as in the fully developed foetus the traces of the lower animals gradually disappear which are so conspicuous in the first months of the fetal life, we have a genuine ethical evolution corresponding to the physical evolution, p. 56. Lombroso used the recapitulationist argument more systematically in his analysis of femininity and the female criminal. All women are in some sense born criminals, according to him, or at least they are less fully evolved human beings than men. Within Lombroso's work the woman, the child, the savage, and the animal become interchangeable. In figure, in size of brain, in strength, in intelligence, woman comes nearer to the animal and the child, atavism and evolution, p. 48. In the psychology of the normal woman dress and personal adornment enter as factors of immense importance. A similar feeling is visible in children and in savages. Woman's natural vengefulness is proof of an inferior psychical development, common not only to children, but also to the lower animals. What terrific criminals would children be if they had strong passions, muscular strength, and sufficient intelligence, and if, moreover, their evil tendencies were exasperated by a morbid psychical activity. And women are big children. The female offender, pages 165. 156, 150, and like children, women are natural criminals. A fund of immorality lies latent in every female, the female offender, p. 216. Whereas the child, at least the white male child, grows out of its primitive state, woman is incapable of higher development. Among her natural shortcomings, Lamraso and his son-in-law William Ferrero, co-author of The Female Offender, list dishonesty, spitefulness, greed, vanity, disrespect for property rights, selfishness, and vengefulness. Fortunately, in the normal woman these latent criminal tendencies are held in check by her biological and psychical conservatism, p. 109. This conservatism is due on the one hand to the immobility of the ovule compared with the zoosperm, p. 109, and on the other to the underdevelopment of the graphic cerebral centers of women in general, p. 174. The monotonous female structure, in other words, is less likely than the male to evince an aberration like atavism, and the sluggish female brain less subject to lesions or other abnormalities that might trigger criminal behavior. This explains why the female-born criminal is less common than the male. The natural form of retrogression in women is prostitution rather than crime, p. 152. The primitive woman was rarely a murderess, but she was always a prostitute, and such she remained until semi-civilist epochs. The female-born criminal, more rare and less natural than the prostitute, loses her claim to femininity because she so closely resembles her male counterpart in her virility of aspect and behavior. Point 1. She is, however, by dint of her superad feminine innate depravity, p. 264, even more degenerate, more savage, more brutal, than he. In general, the moral physiognomy of the born female criminal approximates strongly to that of the male. The atavistic diminution of the secondary sexual characters, which is to be observed in the anthropology of the subject, shows itself once again in the psychology of the female criminal, who is excessively erotic, weak in maternal feeling, inclined to dissipation, astute and audacious, and dominates weaker beings sometimes by suggestion, at others by muscular force, while her love of violent exercise, her vices, and even her dress, increase her resemblance to the sterner sex. Added to these virile characteristics are often the worst qualities of woman, namely, an excessive desire for revenge, cunning, cruelty, love of dress, and untruthfulness, forming a combination of evil tendencies which often results in a type of extraordinary wickedness. The female-born criminal, when a complete type, is more terrible than the male. The female offender, pages 187 to 8, 191. The female offender is perhaps less interesting for this portrait of the female offender than for the composite picture of the normal woman one can extrapolate from it. Besides possessing her latent fund of wickedness, p. 265, the normal woman is unintelligent, conservative, gossipy, impressionable, without pride, and completely without sexual passion. Thanks to her duller sensibility, she is better equipped than a man to endure both physical and moral suffering, pages 270 to 2. The only passion she knows is a stolid maternal sentiment. She loves her husband but feebly, p. 277, and is biologically incapable of friendship with other women, p. 286. Interestingly enough, while some of the author's characterizations of normal femininity, asexuality, childishness, intellectual vacuity, are certainly consistent with Victorian truisms of sexual difference, many of them run counter to other familiar stereotypes. According to the female offender, women have no finer sensibilities, no delicate moral scruples, no purity of mind. The authors might admit of a Dora Copperfield, but not an Agnes Wickfield. Women's love is like the affection of children, intense, but incapable of disinterested sacrifices or noble resignation, p. 161. Their piety is but a dull-minded traditionalism. Even the maternal sentiment is overrated, pages 254 to 5. A question of instinct. Note how abhumanness spreads in Lamraso. It is the condition of the vast majority of peoples across the globe, leaving only two small pockets of fully human populations, Europe and North America. Even these are not intact. Abhumanness penetrates the very household, presided over by the imperfectly evolved European woman. The normative subject who remains is himself endangered, menaced from within by the chaos of his own body, upon which the species history is recorded. And it is in Lombroso's discussion of the born criminal himself, that is, the European male atavist, that one sees his most stringent attempts to fix and contain the meanings of the unstable human body. Lamraso was a self-declared positivist. He described his as the positive school of criminology, and placed great stress on the infallibility of the empiricist practice of science. He began only with facts that could be derived from observation. He developed a system of measurement which relied on scrupulously accurate instrumentation. He painstakingly repeated his measurements so as to include every fact of possible relevance, every aspect of the human body. He performed a detailed quantitative analysis of the data his measurements yielded. He displayed his data in tables showing the relative percentages of physical anomalies in normals and deviants, and then summarized the results of it in prose, outlining its implications clearly for his reader. His conclusions, he believed, were unimpeachable, because each step of the process from which he extrapolated them could be checked and verified. As he admonishes the possible skeptic in criminal anthropology, its origin and application, the only way to explain the opposition to my theory is the reluctance of men to draw a general conclusion from individual observations, p. 38. Observation, dispassionate investigation of facts, and logical inference, he argued, were sweeping aside the old system of ego-emotional judgment characteristic of the primitive periods of science and of periods of scientific degeneracy and decadence, criminal anthropology, p. 34. The lay reader was likely to be confused by Lombroso's articles, unable to penetrate the quantitative analyses or to visualize such criminal anomalies as cercellary arch and frontal sinus enormis, median occipital fossa, suture of the atlas, and double articular face of the occipital condyle, criminal anthropology, p. 36. Among the anthropometric instruments Lamraso deployed were the intimidating sounding spirometer, dynamometer, campimeter, craniometer, Hibbs chronoscope, the Schlitten inductorium, criminal anthropology, pages 50, 53, and finally, the beautiful discovery of one Mr. Anfaso, the tachyanthropometer, which Lamraso terms an anthropometric guillotine. So quickly and with the precision of a machine, does it give the most important measurements of the body, illustrative studies in criminal anthropology, p. 191. And yet Lombroso's instruments, laudinate anatomical terminology, and densely inaccessible figures and percentages give his work the pleasing air of scientific accuracy and credibility. Here one sees science at work, homing in on the human body and chopping it down to a manageable size by means of the anthropometric guillotine. And Lombroso's overall argument is easy enough, and certainly compelling enough, for the layperson to grasp. Criminal anthropology, like the Labatarian school of physiognomy which posited that a person's face was a true indication of character, 18 taught the common sense wisdom of judging human nature by external appearance. Lombroso hoped that his readership would not only comprehend his discipline but also become adept in the practice of criminal anthropology. He emphasizes that the specialized tools of his trade are all very simple instruments, whose manipulation requires little training. In criminal anthropology applied to pedagogy, he instructs school teachers in their use, and even includes instructions for making a home version of Weber's aesthesiometer, p53. The tachyanthropometer, however intimidating its name, is designed to make the practice of anthropometry very easy, even to people who are entire strangers to the science. It permits on a grand scale observations which hitherto were only obtainable by the learned, illustrative studies in criminal anthropology, p191. The spread of abhumanness, in other words, could be checked by the spread of science as it drew the lay population into its purview. Normative subjects, what few were left, equipped with the tachyanthropometer, could measure their own fully human status against the abhumanness of deviants. But the most reliable gauges of atavism, startlingly enough, were bodily symptoms, much like the interwoven symptoms of metaphysical estrangement, uncanniness, abjection, and nausea I have described in Chapter 2. Traditional folk wisdom documents, among normal subjects, a universal though involuntary consciousness of the existence of a physiognomy peculiar to criminals, criminal anthropology, p38. The criminal arouses a shock of horror in the normal onlooker, Ellis, the criminal, p85. The honest man feels instinctive repugnance at the sight of a miscreant, Lombroso Ferrero, p51. Why our intuition leads you unconsciously to shrink from a person who has the face of a thief, criminal anthropology applied to pedagogy, p57. This intuition is especially strong among women, children, and the common people, criminal anthropology, p38. Lombroso cites as examples a young lady who labeled two men as malefactors long before the police were aware of their crimes, and a group of schoolgirls who were able to separate scoundrels from honest men in a set of photographs, criminal anthropology, p38. The criminal is abject, his physiognomy elicits nausea, aversion, revulsion, repugnance at some deep level below consciousness. This dynamic can be explained by heredity. One sense of revulsion in the presence of the atavist is a survival of the fear one's remote ancestors would have felt confronting man-eating predators or cannibalistic savages, whom the atavist recapitulates. Point 19. This would explain the stronger intuition of women, children, and common people, who are less highly evolved and thus more attuned to primitive ancestral fears. In the straight of our brain there must exist elements of the sensations experienced by our progenitors, sensations which are reawakened as soon as the causes are represented which first awakened them. And as in ancient times the wicked were the dominating oppressors and the good were the oppressed, though these latter have been emancipated in the course of time, there remain internal instincts which arouse aversion to those who present that totality of exterior signs which anthropological science has at last explained. Criminal anthropology applied to pedagogy, p58, like gothic nausea, criminal anthropological nausea is multivalenced. At the most visible level it appears as a symptom of estrangement, provoked by confrontation with an anomalous phenomenon, and denial, whereby abhumanness is the property of others but never oneself. Anthropological science, having at last explained the symptom, serves to naturalize it. Anomalies are indeed abominations, and the nauseated body, through its disgust, proves its own integrity. And yet in manifesting the symptom this body undoes itself. To be racked with the convulsions of instinct is to be animalized, thrown back into the remote species memory still inscribed in the body. Here even the normative body is revealed as a palimpsest, bearing within it many savage and animal histories which are always threatening to re-emerge as narratives of abhuman becomings. 5.2 Generalized Animalism. Wells, the Island of Dr. Moreau. The grey creature in the corner leaned forward. Not to run on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? He put out a strangely distorted talon, and gripped my fingers. The thing was almost like the hoof of a deer produced into claws. His face came forward, into the light of the opening of the hut, and I saw with a quivering disgust that it was like the face of neither man nor beast, but a mere shock of grey hair, with three shadowy overarchings to mark the eyes and mouth. The Island of Dr. Moreau, p60. The Island of Dr. Moreau sets out, to a remorseless and almost overwhelming degree, the tenuousness of human identity, and the provisional and mutable nature of species identity in general. The greater part of the novel takes place on an unnamed island 20 inhabited by monstrosities. These are beast people, the abortive results of vivisectionist experiments, by which Dr. Moreau attempts to turn animals into humans. The beast people are liminal entities, like the grey creature in the quote above, neither man nor beast but something in between which, in resembling both, resembles nothing at all. One may chart a certain physical likeness between the not quite evolved beast people and the atavistic criminal types elaborated by Lombroso. Point 21. Their deformities include some of the stigmata Lombroso identified as prevalent among atavists: prognathous face, malformed ears and noses, sloping forehead, shifty eyes and furtive manner, twisted and disproportionate limbs and torso, hunched posture, clumsy, misshapen hands and fingers, and lack of tactile sensibility. Moreau, pages 25, 83-4. What interests me more, however, is a broader similarity between Lombroso's and Wells' works. Each theorizes a human body both chaotic and anthropic, both hybridized and prone to reversion. Moreau constructs his abhumans 22 from an indiscriminate range of animal materials. The island population includes a leopard man, dog man, ape man, puma woman, sloth man, monkey man, wolf woman, and swine men and women. The human body, in other words, reveals its morphic compatibility with, and thus lack of distinction from, the whole world of animal life, including those species occupying different lines of descent. Humanness in general is fractured across many boundaries separating the human from the not human, and individual beast people bodies may violate multiple species categories as well. Emling, whom Prendick finds so disgusting, is a complex trophy of Moreau's horrible skill, a human constructed of bear, dog, and ox, p85. Moreau had blended this animal with that in his experiments, so that a kind of generalized animalism appeared through the specific dispositions, p129. Like Hodgson's octopus seal man, these multiple hybrids, a hyena swine man, vixen bear woman, bear bull, and bear rhinoceros person, are chaotic bodies. They are complex bodies, as Prendick notes, but complexity here denotes indifferentiation and abomination rather than integrity and perfection. Moreau's horrible skill is insufficient. His creatures approach humanist but inevitably revert, returning to the more compelling animal histories inscribed within their bodies. But true humans, as well, are prone to reversion. Human identity in Moreau is an insubstantial thing, continually in danger of dissolution. Like other anthropic narratives, Moreau can imagine only one narrative line, which moves inexorably backwards into loss of specificity. But the prospect one finds there is not barren and silent. It is teeming with abominations, whose changeful and chaotic forms include the dwindling shreds of human identity, p. 129. Hysterical nausea. Prendick is marooned on the island after a hapless series of accidents, and passes through a prolonged period of uneasy speculation into a longer one of horrified certainty. He knows that Moreau's and Montgomery's odd servants arouse in him, inexplicably, a sense of uncanniness and nausea. He learns that Moreau is a vivisectionist who was forced to leave England after his shocking experiments were exposed, p. 32, and he discovers a grotesque community of islanders in the forest and is haunted by one of them, the thing he cannot classify as either man or animal. In the initial pages, Prendick is haunted by vague impressions. The island is full of anomalies, he senses, but he cannot fathom their nature. At times he cannot see clearly enough to know what is wrong, as when he is hunted after dark by the thing, or catches a half-glimpse of some very grotesque creature scuttling into the bushes upon the slope, p. 26. Other times he sees very clearly, but has no language to describe the objects of his gaze. All he can specify are his own symptomatic responses to the strangeness of the islanders. I saw only their faces, he writes of Moreau's boatmen, yet there was something in their faces I know not what that gave me a spasm of disgust. I looked steadily at them, and the impression did not pass, though I failed to see what had occasioned it, p. 25. I could hardly repress a shuddering recoil as Emlyn came, bending amiably, and placed the tray before me on the table, p. 31. Prendick's disgust is initially naturalized within the text, identified as an appropriate response to Emlyn's anomalousness. The captain of the Ipecacuan Ha-1*, the ship which rescues Prendick and then leaves him with Moreau, says that my men can't stand him. I can't stand him. None of us can't stand him, p. 14. These loutish sailors are hardly reliable judges of character, but animals are said to be such, and the dogs on board ship, to whom Emlyn shows no unkindness, savage and worry him at every turn. The animal world itself rises up and identifies Emlyn, the beast man, as an abomination. That Prendick and the crew are also instinctively repelled places them in a continuity with these animals, but nonetheless dogs and men alike are reconstituted through their own revulsion as not abominable, integral members of a proper type. Emlyn is, as well, identified as a black man, a black-faced creature, the black, pages 11, 12, as are other of the islanders, p. 26. Moreau's nauseating boatmen are brown men wearing turbans and peculiar wrappings, vaguely resembling East Indians. The text first invites us to characterize Prendick's disgust as the natural response of a white man to odd natives, who are not quite right to begin with, thus one can account for their unhamlet quality, the familiarity that is yet a strangeness. Prendick, in puzzling over the question of the racial identity of the islanders, is distracted from discovering that their uncanniness is a product of the hybridization of the human form. One might say that he hysterically refuses to consider this possibility. When the truth finally overwhelms him, it is notably occasioned by three swine people, whose skins were of a dull pinkish drab color, such as I had seen in no savages before, p. 39, my emphasis. Their skin color, that is, approximates his own. Suddenly, as I watched their grotesque and unaccountable gestures, I perceived clearly for the first time what it was that had offended me, what had given me the two inconsistent and conflicting impressions of utter strangeness and yet of the strangest familiarity. The three creatures engaged in this mysterious rite were human in shape, and yet human beings with the strangest air about them of some familiar animal. Each of these creatures, despite its human form, its rag of clothing, and the rough humanity of its bodily form, had woven into it, into its movements, into the expression of its countenance, into its whole presence, some now irresistible suggestion of a hog, a swinish taint, the unmistakable mark of the beast, p. 40. The mark of the beast. At this moment it becomes clear that Prendick's symptoms of nausea and uncanniness, as I argued earlier, draw him into a relation of likeness with the beast people. The beast people are uncanny because they remind Prendick not only of some familiar animal, but also of himself. Beast people are grotesque caricatures of humanity, p. 60, but so, too, are humans. All human beings within the novel are capable of animalistic behaviors under extraordinary, and even rather ordinary circumstances. Prendick writes glumly that a strange persuasion came upon me that, save for the grossness of the line, the grotesqueness of the forms, I had here before me the whole balance of human life in miniature, p. 97. The novel continually, and with varying degrees of subtlety, makes the point that the beast community is a mirror of the human community at large. These grotesque islanders are, as Moreau explains to his terrified guest, animals carven and wrought into new shapes by the vivisector's knife, p. 72. Human identity in the island of Dr. Moreau is so unremarkable a thing that it can be duplicated by a few weeks of close labor, wherein Moreau accomplishes what nature, working through natural selection, accomplished in millennia. By means of tissue grafts, intricate surgery, and blood transfusions he transforms the lower species into a higher one capable of speech, reason, erect posture, and the manipulation of tools. The great difference between man and monkey is in the larynx, Moreau tells Prendick, p. 73, and he considers the moral difference between human and animal to be equally negligible. Moreau, like Wells in his article Human Evolution, an Artificial Process, insists that the human race has progressed very little in terms of moral evolution. Very much indeed of what we call moral education is an artificial modification and perversion of instinct, pugnacity is trained into courageous self-sacrifice, and suppressed sexuality into religious emotion. p. 73. Just as human beings are trained to repress their animal instincts through a sort of social brainwashing, so does Moreau train his beast patients to repress their natural savagery, hypnotizing them and implanting fixed ideas about acceptable and unacceptable human behaviors in their brains, pages 81-2. When Prendick visits the beast community in the heart of the forest, he finds that the inhabitants have codified these fixed ideas into oral law. The beast people complete Moreau's training by repeating his hypnotic suggestions in a ceremonial chant called the Saying of the Law, and Prendick, as a newcomer to the community, is forced to participate in the ritual. Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to claw bark of trees, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? P59. This body of law, a series of injunctions against the natural instincts of the animal, has also become the foundation of a crude religion with Moreau as its god. The beast people, with their limited mental scope, P81, imagine that Moreau is omniscient and omnipotent, and has created all their known world as well as themselves. His is the deep salt sea. His are the stars in the sky, P60. They obey Moreau's injunctions because they have been conditioned to do so, because they have developed a pitiful pride in their awkward humanity, and most of all because they fear the wrath of their deity. Any sinner who breaks the law is sent back to the house of pain, back to the hell of the laboratory, for punishment by Moreau. In its ritualism, the beast people's religion parodies Catholicism. The saying of the law is described as an insane ceremony, an idiotic formula, a mad litany, P59. And in its emphasis on prohibitions and punishment, and its worship of an angry, vengeful deity, their religion parodies Calvinism. Though Wells, the contemptuous atheist untroubled by doubt, is certainly not above a gratuitous satire of Christianity, his point here is that religion is only an artificial device by which society attempts to keep savage human nature in check, and that civilization is full of such artifices. Prendick suspects that Moreau was driven to infect the beast people's dwarf brains with a kind of deification of himself partially out of megalomania, P60, but Moreau's more urgent motive is fear of the fierce instincts that might lead the tamed beasts to turn on their master. Moreau's strictest injunction is against the stalking and eating of other men. The sayer of the law carefully emphasizes this prohibition, albeit with a certain wistful nostalgia, warning Prendick that some want to follow things that move, to watch and slink and wait and spring, to kill and bite deep and rich, sucking the blood. It is bad, P61. Moreau loses control of his subjects, and the beast community begins rapidly to deteriorate, when the beast people once again begin to hunt, killing and devouring the rabbits that Montgomery, incidentally, introduced to the island to satisfy his own craving for fresh meat, P28. The taste of blood unleashes all the deep-seated, ever-rebellious cravings of their animal natures, P82, and signals not only general anarchy against the law and the rule of Moreau, but also the commencement of a rapid process of general devolution. The beast people, however, are not the only ones to devolve. All of Moreau's human characters, however recognizable their physical humanity, show traces of a savagery no less natural than that of the beast people, and all of them are lawbreakers of one sort or another. The veneer of civilization, as Wells argued in Human Evolution, an artificial process, is spread most thinly over the artificial man, who is little more than a dressed-up Paleolithic savage. Human Evolution, p. 217, centuries of social evolution have done little to alter the basic animal nature of the human species, in whom moral injunctions have taken as superficial a hold as they have in the beast people. The island of Dr. Moreau begins immediately with the threat of cannibalism, long before the beast people have been introduced. Prendick and two others are trapped aboard the lifeboat of the shipwrecked Lady Bing with little food or water, and after 8 days of agony draw lots to see who of the three will be eaten by the others. Wells backs off from the actual depiction of cannibalism to ***. The loser of the draw struggles savagely with his shipmate, and both are flung overboard and drowned. But Prendick's rescue only introduces the reader to a further series of beastly men. On board the Ipecacuan all is chaos and brutal cruelty, as the loutish crewmen rough up Emling and toss him to the dogs, and the captain throws Prendick off the ship in a fit of drunken rage, roaring, "Law be damned. I'm king here," P22. The two men on the island are not much better. Moreau's assistant Montgomery is a former medical student who had to flee London after indulging in some shabby vice, P109. 11 years ago he lost his head for 10 minutes on a foggy night and committed some unnamed blunder, some violation of the law, pages 18, 109. The years on the island have further brutalized Montgomery, reducing him into alcoholism and into what Prendick suspects is a sneaking kindness for some of these metamorphosed brutes, a vicious sympathy with some of their ways, P84. The novel, partly by refusing to specify the nature of the shabby vice, hints vaguely at Montgomery's homosexuality and thus degeneracy. Prendick's narrative breaks off in the middle of one of the captain's rants about Montgomery, too discreet to repeat his epithets. Well, never mind what he called Montgomery, P14. Prendick himself notes primly later on that I was not curious to learn what might have driven a young medical student out of London. I have an imagination, P18. Montgomery is slightly effeminate, a youngish man with flaxen hair, a bristly straw-colored mustache, and a dropping nether lip who speaks with a slobbering articulation, with the ghost of a lisp, pages 6 to 7. As Regina Gagnier has noted, Moreau was to some extent inspired by Oscar Wilde's trials for homosexuality. Wells wrote in his preface to the book, "There was a scandalous trial about that time, the graceless and pitiless downfall of a man of genius, and this story was a response of an imaginative mind to the reminder that humanity is but animal rough-hewn to a reasonable shape and in perpetual internal conflict between instinct and injunction. This story embodies this ideal, but apart from this embodiment it has no allegorical quality. It is written just to give the utmost possible vividness to that conception of men as hewn and confused and tormented beasts, cited in Gagnier, Idols of the Marketplace." This quote shows at least that Wells considered homosexual behaviors within the realm of the beastly. Although Wells denied any allegorical significance to his tale, one might posit that the text embodies Wilde's genius in the asexual Dr. Moreau, and makes obscure reference to Wilde's homosexuality through the oblique characterization of Montgomery. Moreau is a magnificent specimen of a human being, P80, with a high forehead, tranquil features, and piercing, intelligent eyes. He is, however, a cruel, remorseless, even vicious man who feels no emotion save an all-engrossing passion for his research, a strange colorless delight, he calls it, in intellectual desires, P75. These desires can only be fulfilled by the most prolonged and acute tortures of the victims of the operating table, but Moreau is deaf to their agonized screams. As he tells Prendick, the study of nature makes a man at last as remorseless as nature, P75. While the brilliant Dr. Moreau may represent the apex of human intellectual evolution, he is nonetheless as inhuman as, perhaps more inhuman than, any of his grotesque creations, bereft of the civilizing human emotions of compassion and pity, as indifferent to ethical questions and legalities as Emling confronted with the freshly killed rabbit, the three starving men in the lifeboat, or the drunken captain of the Ipecacuan ha. Prendick even suspects that Moreau's obsession has led him into a secret lust for torture and bloodshed. As he cracks his whip and sentences the leopard man to return back to the house of pain, Prendick notices the touch of exultation in his voice. P93, the namesake of Wells' British doctor is the French neurologist Jacques-Joseph Moreau, whose morbid psychology, 1859, claimed that overexcitation of the part of the brain controlling intellect could cause the malfunction of the rest of the brain, and particularly the atrophy of moral sensibility. 26 JJ. Moreau places the genius on the same family tree as the criminal, the lunatic, and a variety of other patholics and nervous sufferers. The genius over-expenditure of cerebral energy results in immorality and criminal behavior as well as monomaniacal insanity. Point 27. Just as giants pay a heavy ransom for their stature, instability, and relative muscular and mental weakness, Lamrasso wrote in The Man of Genius, a work greatly indebted to morbid psychology, so the giants of thought expiate their intellectual force in degeneration and psychosis. P6. The inevitable corollary of the extraordinary imagination. Moreau, P32, of the vivisectionist Moreau is the stunted morality he shares with these people and with Lombroso's born criminal. He has fallen under the overmastering spell of research to the point of monomania, P33, and pursues his bloody science with no particular end but the fulfillment of his own curiosity. It was the wantonness that stirred me, Prendick writes. I could have forgiven him a little even had his motive been hate. But he was irresponsible, so utterly careless. His curiosity, his mad, aimless investigations, drove him on, P98. Moreau the criminal genius may also be read as a personification of nature itself, a nature whose idle experiments on living flesh are as wanton, as aimless, as random, and finally as cruel, as Moreau's. Each time I dip a living creature into the bath of burning pain, Moreau tells Prendick, I say, this time I will burn out the animal, this time I will make a rational creature of my own, pages 78-9, but what he achieves is only a crude mockery of humanity. I can see through it all, see into their very souls, and see they're nothing but the souls of beasts, beasts that perish, anger, and the lust to live and gratify themselves. There is a kind of upward striving in them, part vanity, part waste sexual emotion, part waste curiosity. It only mocks me, p. 79. Nature, 2, subjects its creatures to pain and suffering through the long process of evolution, refashioning new types of beings, testing their fitness, discarding the failures, only to generate a human species that is itself nothing more than a crude mockery of the idea of humanity, deformed by the mark of the beast from which it came, P75, and thwarted in its upward striving by the soul of the beast. And the work both of Moreau and of nature is subject to undoing. Prendick's first panicked assumption when he uncovers the secret of the laboratory is that Moreau, like Circe on her island, is laboring to transform humans into animals, and that he is marked out as the next victim of this hideous degradation, P51. The idea of human devolution is the ultimate horror within the text. The beast people, mutilated into a semblance of humanity, cannot maintain even this pitiful state, but slowly devolve back into animality. Show me how the things drift back again, the stubborn beast flesh grows, day by day, back again, Moreau tells Prendick, musing on his failures, P77. After Moreau's death and the end of the law, the beast people revert still more quickly to savagery, degenerating into cannibalism, promiscuity, and other primitive human behaviors, and gradually losing speech, manual dexterity, and the ability to walk erect. That fully human bodies are entropic ones as well as made clearest when even Prendick begins to devolve. Prendick is the least beastly of the characters in the island of Dr. Moreau. During the struggle on the lifeboat, he intervenes to help the weaker of the two men. He is a teetotaler, in contrast to Montgomery, and his conscience is continually outraged by Moreau's cruel experiments. Early on, however, the text drops a number of hints linking Prendick to the beast people. On board the Ipecacuan, he becomes excited by the sight and smell of freshly cooked meat, P8. Later the novel describes two meat-eating swine men, blood-stained, about the mouth, and intensely excited, P103. The law states that beast people are not to go on all fours, and Prendick, falling out of his hammock in his bedroom on the island, is deposited, upon all fours on the floor, P49. The beast people identify Prendick as one of their own, not a master but one made, and snicker at him behind his back, P88. Prendick is, furthermore, not a manly character. He might be one of Nordau's hysterics, the typically enervated, nervous, and ineffectual modern gentleman. I waited passively upon fate, he writes when the captain of the Ipecacuan refuses to have him on board and Moreau refuses to take him onto the island, and apologizes for his passivity by explaining that hunger and a lack of blood corpuscles take all the manhood from a man, P22. Throughout the novel he gives way to fits of petulance, hysteria, and morbid indecisiveness. After Moreau's and Montgomery's deaths, Prendick knows that his own life may depend on his ability to instate himself as the new ruler of the beast people, but he breaks down after one feeble attempt at intimidation. I was still inclined to be nervous and to break down under any great stress. And my heart failed me. My imagination was running away with me into a morass of unsubstantial fears. And I allowed my courage to ebb away in solitary thought, pages 119-21. Finally he slinks off to the community and almost apologetically asks for food, shelter, and acceptance. In this way I become one among the beast people in the island of Dr. Moreau, P123. And in this way Prendick gives in to the forces of entropy that overtake the beast people, as the stubborn beast flesh grows back upon him as well. As his companions begin to revert to their original behavior and nature, so too does the narrator undergo strange changes of a devolutionary kind, P129. He picks up animal habits, building himself a den and sleeping in it by day to protect himself from nocturnal prowlers. He even takes to clawing bark, disregarding the fourth injunction of the law. 28, and slowly he comes physically to resemble the beast people. My clothes hung about me as yellow rags, through whose rents glowed the tanned skin. My hair grew long, and became matted together. I am told that even now my eyes have a strange brightness, a swift alertness of movement, P129. Though this episode in Prendick's adventures, what he admits is the longer part of his sojourn on this island of Dr. Moreau, P126, lasts 10 months, his narrative gives it the most cursory attention. He excuses this elision by telling his reader that nothing interesting or relevant occurred during the long months he spent as an intimate of these half-humanized brutes. There is much that sticks in my memory that I could write, things that I would cheerfully give my right hand to forget. But they do not help in the telling of the story, P126. Faced with the ultimate objection, his own devolution into animality, the narrator finally lapses into silence. Exemplary of human bodies. When Prendick returns home to his native island, England, it is only to be haunted by the nightmare of the inevitable devolution of all of humanity. I could not persuade myself that the men and women I met were not also another, still passively human, beast people, animals half wrought into the outward image of human souls, and that they would presently begin to revert, to show first this bestial mark and then that. I look about me at my fellow men, and I go in fear. I see faces keen and bright, others dull, or dangerous, others unsteady, insincere, none have that calm authority of a reasonable soul. I feel as though the animal was surging up through them, that presently the degradation of the islanders will be played over again on a larger scale. P136. This is one of the exemplary human bodies proposed by Moreau, the human body whose humanness is tenuous, incomplete, at all moments liable to regression. However, this anthropic body is a clamorous and energetic one. Back on Moreau's island the night is made hideous with calls and howlings. P131. The beast people are gripping the quivering flesh of prey, gnawing at it and snarling with delight. P131. Moreau's creations devolved not from humans to simple beasts, but into admixed bodies, each recognizable form tainted with that of other creatures and bearing some faint trace of the human past. This is a second exemplary human body, chaotic, abominable, imbued throughout with a generalized animalism. P129. Prendick makes his escape off the island in a lifeboat that drifts on shore, possibly the lifeboat of the Ipecacuan Ha. In the boat he finds two dead men, who had been dead so long that they fell to pieces when I tilted the boat on its side and dragged them out. Prendick flees in the boat in repulsion and frantic horror as three beast people, drawn by the smell, come out of the woods to worry at the remains. P133. The reviewer P. Chambers Mitchell was particularly infuriated by this last, to him needless, detail. Mr. Wells will not even get his hero out of the island decently. P369. But the moment is hardly needless. It is one of many in the fin de siècle Gothic that accomplishes the utter ruination of the human subject, without apology, without nostalgia, without remorse. The human body in all its gross materiality is fully on display here, the decomposing bodies of the sailors, the hybridized bodies of the hungry beast people, the abject body of Prendick, which responds to it all with a spasm of disgust. P133. No human body retains specificity, all have long since become things.